We'll then continue and proceed with our last but not least speaker for today, which is Valentina Tamer, who is a freelance game designer, writer, and artist who most recently worked as an assistant creative lead and narrative lead on Ken Follett's Pillars of the Earth. Today she will talk to us about the changing face of game narratives. So please welcome to the stage, Valentina.
Well, first of all, kudos to everyone who is still in the audience, because it's been a really long day. It's been like 7 hours since it started, so we can give ourselves a pat on the back for learning this much today. This last talk is gonna be more in the direction of development, not so much about company structure, experience as a woman in the game industry, but about the changing face of game narratives, which connects really nicely to the previously made statement that the games industry is changing a lot and you have to adapt to it. And the way we make games is afflicted by that as well. First off, a little bit about myself. My name is Val Tamer. I'm a game designer, writer, and artist. Currently, I am a freelancer, just started this month. But recently, I've worked at Daedalic Entertainment in Hamburg on the Pillars of the Earth, which is an episodic, historic adventure. And a few years back, I've also written for The Night of the Rabbit. And at the Pillars of the Earth, I was assistant creative lead, writer, and game designer. And I've also worked as an artist on Silent Dreams games Dead Age. And I have a Bachelor's of Science in Game Design, which I got at Media Design Hochschule in Düsseldorf. So let's start with the general definition, what narrative design is, because narrative designers know what narrative design is, but sometimes even games companies aren't that sure about the borders between game design, game writing, narrative design, and sometimes when a company says narrative design, they mean game writing, and so to get ourselves some introduction to that. Maybe you think that narrative design is plot, dialogue, and cutscenes, but that's not even half of it. Narrative design in a game is all of this. It's the narrative experience that comes from game design and story and dialogue together. So the way a game is played tells the story as much as the words that the player hears. It's not only plot, but it's also what can the player do, how can they do it, when can they do it, how's the feeling while they do it. As you can see, there's a whole huge list of stuff, what can be the tool set of the narrative designer. It's writing, game mechanisms, the game structure, game systems, environment design, level design, character design, cinematic design, animation, sound design, visual design, and so on and so forth. Which doesn't mean that these jobs don't need specific teams. They do, but you can narrate a story with these tool sets as well. So a narrative designer often collaborates very closely with basically the entire team and is like the glue, especially between game writers and game designers. So in the past few years, narrative-driven games have gotten a lot of attention. They seem to be pretty popular, and there seems to be a general consensus on what is considered good game storytelling. And we're not actually going to go into detail what actual good storytelling is, but I'm just saying that's what the general consensus in media seemed to be. Games like Life is Strange or the Walking Dead games by Telltale, Uncharted series, and Firewatch as some examples. So we basically have episodic adventures that are narrative-driven, have branching storylines, where player choice is very important and where you can influence the story with your actions. But you also have expansive open worlds to explore, like to some extent Firewatch. But there were also always epic, rather linear stories. Throughout the last few years, we had a few so-called walking simulators pop up, usually in the indie department, which were called that way because game mechanics were reduced in favor of more narrative-driven gameplay, and they were kind of like they can often become something like walkable visual novels. But games like these could be a problem in the future. I don't say that they're bad games or that making those games wouldn't result in making a good game or that their structure is somehow invalid, but I'm talking about the industry and how practical they are. Because there has been a change going on that's been like that. It's a trend that has been like this for a long time. But it's really starting to escalate, and that is the budget of video games. We've come from games like Pong to games like Far Cry 5. So you can see that there must be a little bit of a budget difference, and Ref Koster has actually released a study a few months back, where he looked at the budget demands of games throughout the years, and he's realized that there is very obviously a trend of games just getting more and more and more expensive, especially AAA titles. The diversion between AAA and indie just becomes larger. And now we also have like AA titles, which are somewhere in between, but the most expensive games become more expensive. This is a problem because games have been sold for around $60, and I say bucks because dollars, pounds, euros. Around that price, and I mean AAA titles, for some while, but they've just kept getting more expensive despite the same price. So it's becoming increasingly hard to make a profit out of the same amount of game. And especially in the indie department, we have an increasing competition due to more games getting released every day. And the increasing budgets come from the demand for extensive game worlds and long play times, but also increasingly high graphical demands. So when you combine more expensive games in regards to the level of detail, but people also want multiple endings, which all have to be created separately, then you just get a game that is very expensive regarding price per byte and price per game play time. And something that afflicts both AAA and indie companies is, as I said, the increasing numbers of releases, because releases are not bound to the shelf anymore, but we have Steam, and it's gotten easier to publish your game on Steam, so the numbers have increased drastically, especially because tools are so readily available nowadays, which is awesome, but it also results in a flood of games, and it's getting harder and harder to establish yourself. And there is also YouTube Let's Plays and Twitch, which might influence the purchasing behavior, because if you have a narrative-focused game, which is linear, people might just watch a Let's Play of it and then call it a day, because why would they buy it themselves if they don't get another experience? So we have that pressure as well. In the recent past, we've seen some financial strategies to counteract that: microtransactions, loot boxes, season passes, episodic releases, pre-alpha releases. But that's financial stuff when we're going to talk about narrative strategies. Some of those do come into play, though. What we might want from a game to make it more profitable, also from the narrative standpoint, is creating replay value or unique player experiences, keeping the players invested over a longer time to enable additional content for smaller prices, and emergent game experiences, as in they're not authored or pre-scripted, but they come from the system or the player interaction. They emerge automatically, so to say, which increases the variety that doesn't have to get scripted. But new ways of telling a story, especially in indie games, experimental stuff, allows a chance to establish yourself on the market, but it's hard, and there's luck involved, but it should be dismissed. So I will have a look at a few recent developments. It's supposed to be more of an overview and not an in-depth, detailed, step-by-step, how do you make a good game narrative with this system, but more of a, hey, these are cool things that are happening, and we might see more of that in the future. If you want to create interesting game narratives, you can consider going there. The first one is games as a service, which can be something like game subscriptions as World of Warcraft, MMO, and other online gaming like Overwatch or League of Legends, free-to-play, like Candy Crush Saga or Team Fortress 2, season passes, and there's two different kinds of season passes. There's the Telltale-style season pass, where you get the episode of a series, all episodes of a series, and there are the regular season passes, where you get all downloadable content for a game upon release. Microtransactions, like in Overwatch or Star Wars Battlefront 2. But having a game as a service is a long-running endeavor. It's not you throw it out there and then you never work on it again. You have to employ people to constantly work on it. So you have to deliver equally high-quality content for a long time. You have ongoing development costs, and you have to take care of coherence in an ever-expanding game. Because you don't want a new event suddenly to really mismatch the tone of the entire game and upset your players. When you create narratives for games as a service, very generally spoken, you need a story world that can host the wide variety of stories you want to tell in it. That is the biggest a challenge for the narrative designer creating this world, where you can see a potential for more episodes, more seasons, more missions, more characters. You have to see how your narrative units are supposed to look. Are they going to build up on each other as story arcs? So they're going to be self-contained little short stories? Or is it going to have this main story and then a few side stories? Or is additional content only cosmetic, or does it give you a gameplay advantage and only influences the way you perceive the game, but not plot or dialogue or something, which still influences the narrative because you feel, for example, more powerful and your character appears in a new light due to that. And you have the possibility of a social experience through interaction with other players, which doesn't apply to all games as a service. But there is potential in that too, purposefully crafting a toolbox, a sandbox for other players to have narratives with each other, which is directed by the world you have created. They don't exist independent from that. So you have that whole environment that you can craft and still influence them in that way. The same applies to player-generated content, like levels in, for example, map editors. You might think that as a narrative designer, you wouldn't have any control over that anymore, but with the tools that you give the player, you influence the narrative already. You set the tone, you set the world, you suggest themes, and so on and so forth. As the next story structure, I'm going to have a look at the systemic narrative. Some examples on the side. There's different types of systematic narratives. There are world systems, like in the Far Cry series or Zelda Breath of the Wild. There are character systems, which is AI stuff, like in Event Zero. And there's story systems, like in the indie games, The Novelist and Facade. In this approach to narrative, the traditional plot is replaced by the narrative experience. So it's not about the author's intent, but about the spontaneous experience of the player. Sometimes games mix and match, like Far Cry mixes both of these approaches. A systemic narrative is a system emerges. There's systemic game design as well, but the systemic narrative comes with it, so to say. It's a system made up of units that adhere to rules that influence each other. They have inputs and outputs, and they can overlap. So in more human words, you have the unit tiger and the unit pirate, and they both have the output sound and visual. They can be heard and seen, and they also have these inputs. So when they overlap, they get aware of each other, and the tiger attacks the pirate. And the player doesn't have to do anything, and the narrative designer has not designed this event, but it's just something that happens because these units in the system have acted according to the rules that have been set up by the game designer, narrative designer, probably. These systems also contain stuff like weather or physics, chemistry, and so on and so forth. There also might be the addition of unique motivations for the single units. And it's important to give consistent rules here because the player is supposed to make plans using these systems. There's three different approaches to these systems. There's a simulation-centric approach where you literally have a system and the player can do anything in it, like in The Sims. There's a narration-centric approach, which builds up on that, where you create a so-called state space, where you have different narrative units that the player navigates inside, kind of like triggering different developments of story that are placed upon that system. And there's procedurally generated content, which can be both of these things, but includes algorithms that randomly create worlds, characters, animals, whatever is needed. The potential of the systemic narrative is that it can deliver very unique and meaningful possibilities of interacting with the world because it feels alive. The player is not bound by the author's intent, which means there can be a way longer playtime as long as the player is motivated. There is a greater variety of solutions based on world rules, which means that the way a game story plays out can be extremely individual because the players aren't bound to the one single right solution. So this has great potential for emergent narratives and anecdotes to tell your friends. And there is potential for players setting their own little goals. They noticed, like in Far Cry 3, at one point I realized, oh, some of the pirate camps have tigers in cages. Why don't I just try to knock them all out by just releasing the tiger? So yeah, so that was my goal, just finding all the tiger cages, even though it wasn't like an intended thing you should do. The next narrative structure is transmedia storytelling. I found myself being surprised by how I didn't think of Pokemon first. The first game I thought of was Overwatch, but then I was like, wow, Pokemon is like so big that that I didn't even notice it as a transmedia epic. But like transmedia storytelling as a term stands for telling a story in more than one medium. So it's not only told within a video game, but there might be like comics, novelizations, films, series, social media posts, interviews, events, toys, all of that. And Overwatch, for instance, has very little in-game story. It's a multiplayer online shooter where you choose one of these different characters, and yeah, you have teams battling against each other. And the characters are very uniquely designed and have their backstories and their connections, but they're not addressed within the game. But you have a huge expanse of lore that is constantly expanded upon through short films, comics, and so on and so forth. The challenges of transmedia storytelling is that, again, you need to create a coherent world and a media experience across all the different media. You need to keep enough narrative within the game so the players don't need to do homework to enjoy the game. This sometimes also applies to games that put their lore into documents you can find in-game. When you have to do homework to enjoy playing a game, maybe reassemble your stuff. The thing with transmedia storytelling is you're probably an expert for games. Probably another thing, you could probably dabble in lots of different media, but the experts are probably somewhere else. So you probably have many different teams are working on the same franchise, and there's the additional challenge of keeping the vision and not accidentally creating inconsistencies. But there's also the potential of using the different advantages of media channels in order to tell different aspects of a world. A comic has other advantages than a game or a novel, and this can create a more rounded experience, so to say, and a very big world to explore. There's also the potential of social connection and identification, as in there's so much stuff that you can always surround yourself with it, and people are more likely to become involved in fandoms. It enables the creation of experts, like people who exchange information on forums and become experts on the lore of a game. You can circumvent media fatigue by offering different kinds of media to interact with. And you can encourage participation of the community more expansively. And lastly, I wanted to say a little bit about VR as well. Even though that's not a solution for the budget problem, this is more of this is happening right now. People are probably, there's lots of interesting stuff happening. There's going to be more interesting stuff happening. And it would be stupid to leave it out of the talk. So the challenges of VR is that it's mostly isolating when you play it at home, because you have your ears are covered, your eyes are covered, you probably don't even see your friends anymore. An exception is VR chat and stuff like that. So that changes the narrative experience. There is a time limitation due to motion sickness that might occur in people. But the motion sickness in general is a big issue. Like, you have a 360 world all around you, and the story somehow has to function in those 360 degrees. But the player can only see 96 degrees at a time. So, but you can't take the camera away from the player, because as soon as the player cannot control the camera with their own head movement anymore, they're gonna feel really sick. So you can say goodbye to all these cutscenes. All cutscenes now have to be as if you're standing right next to actors doing stuff. Yeah, so the attention is also a very important factor, which you have to actively design for. So in a movie, you know, okay, we have the camera, and everything that is within the frame is going to be seen by the audience at all times. No, you have to kind of force the player to look where it's interesting, using sound cues, visual cues, light, content, and so on and so forth. Yeah, and the movement is also limited, either fixed or within a limited square, or rail movement or teleportation, but you can't move around like you do in video games. Yeah, one of the things that I mentioned down there is that VR might be interesting for rental rooms, like VR cafes. So this would limit the time spent there, like maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour, and how these narratives are framed. Like where you experience a narrative should influence how it's made, because you're in another mindset. You may play with friends and you're all in the same space. So yeah, that might be something to consider as well. In VR, there's new kinds of, there's like 4 basic types of player roles that you can design narratives for. There's the observant active, which is like godlike, which is like having an overview, like an omniscient view. There's observant passive, which is like 360 videos. You can't do anything, you can just look around and see it happen. There's participant active, which is like the video games we know. And there's participant passive, where you have to play a role, how it's given, and you can't respond in any meaningful ways. But VR also has the potential to create very intense experiences, putting you in the shoe of others, a so-called empathy machine. There's the potential to manipulate self-awareness and ideas of body ownership. There's been this one experiment where people were literally seeing themselves from a third-person perspective. Some of you might have seen that because there was a camera placed on top of them, and they had a VR set on, and they saw themselves from a third-person perspective, and that was a very surreal experience. And there's also potential for embodied cognition, as in being somewhere is a more intense learning experience than looking at pictures of it. And you can put the player into a world and situation directly instead of having the screen and the avatar as the mediator. They are just literally there. Okay, after we've looked at all these different very interesting narrative structures, some of you might think, wait, systems and reducing narrative and VR, like shortening stuff, and what does it even mean? That doesn't sound like there's going to be traditional storytelling in games anymore. Does this mean that games will only be told through what players do and not by authorial intent anymore? Is game authorship dead? Well, no, to put it shortly. Just because there's world systems, emergent narrative, and player-created content, writers are not superfluous, especially not narrative designers. There's not one traditional way to tell a story, especially a game story. There's always been very different ways of telling a story. Even Space Invaders tells a story, and there's no cutscenes. There's no dialogue, but it still tells a story, a narrative. The thing is, with all these things emerging now and experimental stuff happening in the indie industry, it's just that we're exploring the more unique possibilities in which games can tell stories, things that, like ways that novels can't do, movies can't do, none of the previous media can do. These are the things that games can do, even though nobody else can. But it's all pretty, unexplored territory. There's been some exploration, of course, extensive exploration, but this is not the end of it. Also, linear stories in games won't die out from suddenly. The new God of War game, there's no fancy experimental hardcore narrative thing going on. There is a linear story. It's an epic cinematic experience, and it's doing pretty well from what I've heard. Linear stories won't completely disappear. Also, indie games still have other possibilities. There's been a lot of interesting experiments in narrative design where you have various author-driven designs, so to say, where the player can influence the story with their actions, sometimes more, sometimes less, and through other experimental factors, or just relatability, or the honesty of the stories, they've become popular. The thing is, when you create a great game story, there are so many different ways to do it right, and people will probably respond to honesty and good craft. So saying something like, oh no, that kind of storytelling is not trendy anymore. Like, maybe trends aren't everything. Also, even if we would think that now all these things that I mentioned before are the only kind of games that are getting made right now, the purpose of a narrative designer is more than that. To think back to the slide before, this is all narrative design, and that's not going away. You can tell a story through what kind of stuff you see on the way, even though there's no words. You can tell a story by giving the player certain types of interactions. You can tell a story simply through sound design, even. So, yeah, the game authorship is not dead. Yeah, my conclusion is people love game narratives, and even though there is change happening, as it is always in the games industry, these are just changes that are probably going to result in more games exploring how games can tell a story in a game way, and not in a movie way, not in a novel way, but in a way that only games can do. And I think that's very exciting. We also should adjust what our understanding of what a narrative is, and think beyond plot and dialogue, and yeah, explore the unique strengths of games. And yeah, exciting stuff. Yeah, and that's it.